etc. It is originated from the Armed Forces Ordinance 1942 and passed as Armed Forces Manipur and Assam Special Powers Act 1958 in Parliament. After the implementation of this act, in certain region of all people of the state, it can be said that laws are made on the basis of race, religion, and people. The idea of rule of law without any differences on the basis of sex, race, color, and people of a modern democratic state has been compromised by the very implementation of this act in the last 5 decades in some part of this country. Why such kind of law can exist so long? What is the politics of this act? How AFSPA can be understood in an academic and public discourse? How can we imagine the society under Armed Forces Special Powers Act 1958? So, Dr. Sudha will be speaking on Indian State Armed Forces Special Powers Act and rule of law. So, now I'm human rights activist, Colin Kansal will speak on human rights and security law in India in reference to Armed Forces Special Powers Act. So I would like to invite Dr. Sudha to talk.
Sheer brutality of the law and the viciousness, I think most of you already saw in the film. I don't think I can say if you're not convinced by the kind of brutality that goes on every single day. I think you've seen the film for about an hour, you'd have realized it's happening again and again and again, even in the hour that you were sitting there. And to imagine that this is actually happening again and again and again over 52 years, more actually, is something that I think if the film did not convince you, a picture did not convince you, I'm not sure I can do it. So that is not what I'm going to talk about. Right? I'm assuming that that is something that is there from the film. In fact, when Rosie first spoke to me, you also told me not to talk specifically about AFSPA or about Manipur, but rather about a broader issue and how to look at it in a broader sense, and that is what I'm going to do. What I'm going to try and think through and discuss with you is why is AFSPA or, taking a stand on AFSPA and worrying about AFSPA important for those of us, people like us who are sitting here, not for people who are actually suffering directly, as you saw in film, but for people like us for whom, it's happening out there. So that's what I'm going to talk about. In some sense, I think even in the context of Manipur, AFSPA is much more of a symbol than really everything that is to the story. And in some sense, I'm going to argue that the death of Manorama, right, or the presence of AFSPA, the constant presence of AFSPA for 52 years in this place, or the simple fact that a young woman who is about the age of, average age of people in this room, for 10 years has not had a single morsel of food. And the entire mighty power of the Indian state, but also the Indian nation, is unable to answer this young woman. So what I'm going to argue is that this kind of thing is something that is not about the death of a single woman somewhere on the margins of a nation state called India, but instead, in fact, is significantly the gradual death of the notion of an independent, free republic, a democratic republic called India. Right? So I'm going to bring it right here to us and the idea, to us in the sense of India, whatever that means, and the Indian nation as much as the state and law. I'm not going to refer as much to the legal aspects, the legibility of AFSPA. Many of you, in fact, as I look around this room, probably know much more about the Act and its impact than I do, and of course, we have someone who's professionally much more capable of doing that. So what I'm going to do is look at it in the context of India as an independent democratic republic, and what it means to all these concepts when we say that there are regions that are within the territory of India that have had all kinds of laws for this amount of time, in spite of public protest. In fact, what I'll do is go back to the Constitution of India. One of the longest constitutions in the world. And Ambedkar, at the time when it actually came, it was enforced, actually made a statement that here we give you a progressive constitution. And it needs to be so long, precisely because we're trying to embed it in a particularly undemocratic social setting. So So there was already that idea of whether even this idea, the basic ideas, principles of rule of law that get enshrined in our long constitution is something that can actually be enacted in practice. And something like what you saw in the film and what's happening with laws like AFSPA, but more specifically AFSPA, in these regions of India, I think actually gives more support to that kind of hesitation. That perhaps we do have to address the issue of civil society also in India, and it's, the fact that perhaps the idea of, republicanism or the idea of independence actually hasn't taken root. What I will do for this is actually try and differentiate between the idea of a subject and a citizen. When a country is under colonialism and independence, you assume one of the things that happens, the idea of independence, is simply that earlier you had a state of which you were a subject. The state has laws that it will impose on you. The state has its own army, it has its own police. It uses it to control its subjects. Right? We did have India under colonialism, and the idea was that the colonial state would control its colonized subjects. The idea of independence was fundamentally that now the state is of the people. So the basic purpose of your police or of your army or all the other arms of the state is not to control the subjects, but to protect the rights of its citizens and the idea of rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. And one of the most basic, perhaps, rights is the right that if some wrong is done to you, you have the right to appeal. The state is there precisely for that reason, that when something wrong is done to you, you have the right to appeal to somebody and say, look, something has happened and there is an inquiry that happens. And what AFSPA does is precisely take this kind of right away. Let's be very clear, a number of laws do this. It's not only AFSPA that does this. Right? We have a whole range of laws in our nation, within our country, that actually do precisely this, take away this right of appeal, which is in fact very, very fundamental. But the interesting thing that a law like AFSPA does is that it applies this kind of taking away of rights to an entire set of people. It identifies an entire group of people and immediately converts them from being citizens to being subjects of the state. Because if the idea of a citizen is simply that the state is there to protect you. If you look at even I think there was an army officer in the film who was saying, we are here in order to protect the people of Manipur. And everything else that you saw in that in the film that you just saw now actually belies that basic idea that the Indian state has the ability to treat people of all regions as citizens, as rights-bearing citizens, and the state, in fact, is only a state of the people. The other kind of thing that I want to point out is the interesting way in which AFSPA comes into play, comes into enactment. You actually think of the army coming in order to aid the civil forces. There's a basic difference between having a police and having an army. Right? You have internal disputes all the time, you have the police there to sort of maintain law and order, and then you have the army. And the army is fundamentally thought of to deal with enemies against the nation, not as dealing with law and order problems within what we think of as the nation. In some sense, AFSPA comes in with the basic idea, with the premise that all that is happening is that the army is merely assisting civilian maintenance of law and order. So in 1958, you have the idea that this is a temporary thing, they're assisting the police in doing what they are normally expected to do. And that, in fact, gives us this idea of extraordinary law. And often you hear this term used that, these are extraordinary laws. It's something that's out of the ordinary. We're not sure, after 52 years, after all these protests, you really have to ask if a particular, specific regions of India remain extraordinary forever. So then what is ordinary? What is ordinary in the way that the Indian state looks at the people of Manipur, not just Manipur, but several other regions of India? What is the ordinary way in which an independent state, Indian state, looks at these sets of people? Again, this is a kind of argument that has been made about probably all extraordinary laws. There are, again, a number of laws that do this kind of things. I mean, things like NISA, TADA, POTA, many of you would have heard these acronyms, and these are, so in fact, a number of these laws do precisely this. They, I'm sorry, I'm losing. I want to go back to the idea of the subject that I started off with. One of the things that AFSPA does in all of these regions is it does not apply or deal with individuals. Or a lot of your other laws are expected to deal with individuals who might be a threat to a particular nation, a nation state. What a law like AFSPA does is it assumes that the people of an entire region collectively are in fact the enemy to whatever it is that they're trying to protect. So one of the things that perhaps all extraordinary laws do, but particularly AFSPA does, is it actually plays on the politics of exclusion. It identifies and excludes certain sets of people from the rights that are due to them as citizens of India. Remember, I'm talking about all this from the perspective of a person in Delhi, of India. I'm talking about citizenship. In fact, assuming that we are the people who are interested in retaining all of these as part of India, the least we can do is accept that they are citizens of India. Right? In fact, there's an interesting report that came out on the women of Manipur in one of the women's study conferences that is actually titled, "They want our labor, they don't want our people." And that is something that we have to fundamentally deal with when we're dealing with something like AFSPA. In order to claim any of these territories, areas as a part of India, the basic thing that we need to do under our constitution is actually treat people as citizens. And treating people as citizens meaning respecting fundamental rights, and most of all the right that they have somebody in the Indian state to appeal to. I don't know if you were able to read the little things that were written, as the film was going on. In fact, what AFSPA does is precisely that it does not allow people to appeal when there is any kind of killing or rape that happens. In fact, another small thing that I want to point out that AFSPA is probably the tip of the iceberg. If you talk to people about what's going on, I think the film stopped in 2004, and if you look at what's going on since then, there are regions of Manipur where AFSPA has been removed. And what you actually find is that the killings have not stopped. The police in Manipur has been as brutal as perhaps the army which comes under the AFSPA. In fact, I think even in the film, I think the university, the brutal beatings which I heard many people in the audience were sort of horrible to watch, was in fact the police, which doesn't come under AFSPA, and yet this gone on. So the argument that I'm trying to make here is not that AFSPA needs to be repealed because, that will stop the killings in Manipur. Nor is it that AFSPA is a very inhuman law that takes away human rights and therefore it needs to be repealed. Nor is it that the people of Manipur are strongly voicing the fact that AFSPA should be repealed and therefore it should be repealed. I stand by all of these. Right? I will make all these arguments. But I'm trying to bring in the idea that there is another reason why we should demand that something like AFSPA should not go on. And that reason has to do with the self-interest probably of anybody who lives within this territory called India. Simply that if you believe in any kind of notion of citizenship, the fact that there needs to be a rule of law which is same for all citizens, which is something that Rajesh has written in his write-up and also, that he mentioned right in the beginning. So in fact, the very basis of India being an independent republic, democratic republic, I think is being threatened by the continued presence of something like that. And even that fundamental reason is enough for us to argue for the repeal of AFSPA. But again, I'll end with something slightly, since I did mention that AFSPA alone is not going to solve the problem of Manipur. I also want to point out that when we demand for a repeal of AFSPA, we're actually asking for the very, very minimum. We're actually asking that then you come and kill our people, then you come and rape our women.